Welcome to the Greater Culture Podcast, where movement, mindset, and mastery meet. Join us as we explore the art of living fully with expert guests and real-life stories to inspire your journey. And welcome to another episode of the Greater Culture Podcast with your host, Brad Marshall. And today, really excited to be joined by Max El-Hag from Training Think Tank, someone who's been in the space, in the fitness space for a number of years, including CrossFit space. We've connected over the last couple of years. Our affiliate uses Training Think Tank's programming, and we've loved that and really appreciate what Max has built over there. So I'm excited to have a conversation and hear a little bit more about his coaching story and what we can learn from him over the years. So Max, thanks for spending some time with me on the podcast today.
Thanks for inviting me, man. Hopefully it's a good conversation.
Yeah. And like I said, you've been in the fitness space for a while now, and specifically CrossFit, but I do find it's always interesting to hear what people's sort of origin story is or how they got into the field that they're in now. So take us back and tell us, how did you come to find coaching and get into it?
Well, it's kind of been my whole life, really, that I've been involved in an obsession with athletics and fitness. My dad was an Olympic athlete who was obsessed with training and pushing himself. My mom trained in the gym and did personal training and fitness modeling. So I got chubby as a little kid, and that was like the first nutrition, training, I got to be a man. I can't turn into this little fat slob. You get picked on a little bit. My brother and sister were very tall, lean, slender athletes. And I was more of a shorter, stocky build. I mean, I'm 5'11", so I'm not super short. But that, I think, was the mental draw originally to fitness. And I did some personal training when I was in high school. We had a gym at the house. And then I kind of went on this journey to go into the financial world. I went to school for finance and accounting. I went to school to play 2 sports, but had so many injuries that I got out of it and came out of school during the credit crunch. And I was working with one of my college roommates' dad in Florida. And I was just like, man, I want to do what I love. I want to train people. I want to coach. I was spending all of the money that I was making going and taking certs on functional medicine and supplementation and hiring coaches. And I was doing martial arts. And then I found CrossFit because back in the early days, BJ Penn was using CrossFit methodology, and Fight Gone Bad was one of the famous workouts. And somebody from my fight gym owned CrossFit Delray Beach. And he basically went over there, did CrossFit for the first time. Then I started working in that CrossFit gym. I started building a one-on-one training in that CrossFit gym. I hired James Fitzgerald as a coach for CrossFit. Then I went and ended up working for James for a couple of years. And then that kind of just snowballed the journey for me to kind of keep learning and evolving in the CrossFit niche specifically.
At that young age, you mentioned your parents being very high-level athletes. Did they kind of serve as coaches for you in those early days of kind of guiding and helping you with the nutrition and that side of the house? Because I think at that age, it's very interesting of I'm starting to notice, maybe I'm not looking the way I'd like. Let me figure this out. So what was that process like at a young age?
They were involved a little bit. They went bankrupt when I was kind of young. So my mother took a job in Boston and was working in Boston during the week and coming home for the weekends. And my dad was commuting every day, either to New York City or to Philadelphia. So I think in the earlier years, part of the reason I had maybe weight issues is you're at home and you're a little kid. So you're eating SpaghettiOs because the only thing you can do is microwave. I didn't know how to cook or do any of that stuff. When I started to get a little bit more athletic in terms of taking it seriously, I won a youth wrestling state title when I was 10 or 11. And in that phase from 4 to 11, I think my dad kind of served as coach in that realm. We had a wrestling mat at home. And then kind of my relationship, probably a lot of people with their parents, the relationship kind of fractures. It's hard to take advice that way. And I just started learning on my own, buying Muscle and Fitness. My brother was into fitness and was fitness modeling and was a Division I wrestling prospect. So he kind of helped. And then I ended up getting coaching in all of these different realms. I had a local gym that I was going to, and I would pick the brains of the personal trainers there. I had a wrestling coach that was outside of my high school wrestling coach that gave feedback on nutrition. And I think I just pieced things together over time. But the science on nutrition back then wasn't very good, especially in wrestling. It was just starvation, really. There was not like a proper way to do it. They didn't explain the weight cuts. So I think I was like right before the generation that came up with really good information. So we just were like kind of figuring it out at that time with no real guidance.
Yeah. And then it sounds like as you continue to grow and get into wrestling, some coaches were provided for you as well as the fitness trainers. So what were the coaches like in those kind of formative years of middle school, high school? Because I feel like those are the folks who really shape and influence the way you think about coaching or then what you end up kind of being like or not being like as a coach later on.
Yeah, I think each one was different. And I think at the time, I was a very angry young man. Like when I hit puberty, my rebelliousness like really took over and my aggression was really high. So I think I was more of like it was a big fish in a little pond situation. So I was like a multi-time all-state athlete in football and wrestling in New York, which is not like I was, going to Florida State to play football, but I was like a pretty good athlete. And in a small school or like a moderate school in New York, my coaches always wanted to get more out of me. But I didn't like being yelled at. I didn't like being told what to do. And I was really kind of uncoachable at that time without realizing I was uncoachable. Like I was one of the best players on the team, but then not elected captain by the coaches. But then I knew my teammates would like listen to me if I spoke. I think that ironically, I love coaching, but I think I probably did a disservice to my coaches growing up. Like I wasn't really a great team player. And I think I wanted, without knowing it, I wanted more from them. Like I wanted my home life was tough and my dad was tough. So going into a school situation where people are yelling at you or, you know, doing things that make you not feel good for me didn't motivate me. But that was just the cultural motivation. And I think for a kid who, you know, wasn't getting tough love at home, getting tough love from their coach was like, yeah, I get this because it pushes me. But for me, I was like, don't yell at me. Like it would make me upset and rebellious. So I think I learned over time that everybody individually needs something different from the person they're working with. And I think in the earlier years when I left coaching, I looked back and I wanted to be a coach that was better than all the coaches that I felt let me down. Then kind of you get older and you come full circle. And I actually went back and talked to some of those coaches and thanked them. Like I didn't realize that they were keeping me more stable and that they were trying to make me a better person and that they were trying to help me with my anxiety and like the things that were stopping me from performing. So I think over time I realized that those earlier coaches were such a good influence on me, but there was a big part of my life where I was like, oh, they didn't serve me like coaches should have. And I think that's where my obsession with knowledge and physiology and making sure that like, hey, no matter what problem somebody comes to me with, I want to solve it for them. Like I don't want to leave them disappointed. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how it
No,
started.
I think it's always fascinating because, in those years, if you look at the brain science of it, like our prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet. So we don't have the ability to really like discern, like think about ourselves and our place in the world and how this coach is interacting. We just sort of put two and two together. And I'm interested to hear, you mentioned, being in wrestling and football. When we think of those sports, those can be a very aggressive type of sport that aggression leads to success on the mat and on the field. So you just put two and two together. Like if I'm aggressive, I can be successful in sport and maybe in life. Is that kind of what happened for you there? Of like, as you got angry and aggressive, like you started to experience success in those realms. And now you're like, well, this is the path.
Yeah, yeah. And it was like a gift, I think, for whatever reason, ability to control and harness my rage into like a forceful interaction was just like it's something that I was gifted as a person. So I felt very comfortable in that realm. Started winning all the time. You have this energy inside of you that you like need to get out and you can literally take it out on other people and then get praised for it. But what I realized over time, and I've been in some of like the best wrestling rooms in the world with some of the baddest fighters on the planet, and I've went to football camps with people that were drafted into the NFL. You start to realize like, oh, you can't do that on people that are built different, right? Like you try to let your aggression out on somebody who's 6'4", 250 that runs a 4.5. You run full speed into them to try to like freaking headbutt them and you can knock yourself out, or like you buckle your knees and go backwards. So I think life over time humbled that out of me by nature of not staying in the smaller environments where you can get away with just kind of being a reckless banshee. You start to learn like, okay, well, the best people in the world at fighting, say, they might have that power and that ability to release it, but they know when to time it. They know how to put themselves into a position so they can hit the exact right spot with it. And if you're reckless in your approach of somebody like that, you are going to get severely hurt. So it starts to change your, like, that maturity starts to change and like lower the aggression, because you got to like think before you act and realize like, oh, that's a really big person. Like if I'm going to engage with them, they better be tired or I better be ready to move. Or so it was like an interesting psychological journey to realize that my aggressive outlet couldn't be sports like that, because it was going to be self-harmful. I was giving myself concussions. I was breaking my own bones, right? Like you go and you try to hit somebody as hard as you can and you break your hand. You're like, this is harmful to both of us.
Yeah, that ability to learn emotional regulation is so hard, especially at that age, and it almost takes so much time. And it's always funny when you get to a certain age, you're like, man, if only I knew then what I know now, like I could have been a totally different athlete, and maybe things would have been different. But it's just the process and the journey for everyone. And so you mentioned you got into finance then, and so how long did the finance stint last for you? Because it sounds like you're really passionate about sport. You realized that wasn't going to be the career. So I got to go find something to pay and do the 9-to-5 thing. So how long did the financial stint last for you?
Well, it was all of my undergrad, and every summer I went to work on Wall Street. So I went to work with a hedge fund one summer. I went to work with Goldman Sachs one summer. I went to work with UBS one summer. And that UBS internship was in my junior year going into senior year. So it was kind of like a recruiting tool to get a job in that space. And it was the biggest trading floor in the world at the time that I went there. It was like literally like walking into a football field. But it was right in 2008 when the economy collapsed. So imagine being on a football field with like 50 people working in a big room because everybody else got fired. And so that we knew like no jobs were coming from this. The culture was just like palpably upset. Like it wasn't thriving and people weren't happy. Everyone was scared to lose their job. And so I didn't really get a job coming out of college. And my roommate's dad was a very successful entrepreneur that basically funded us to start our own business. And I wish I could say like I did a lot in those early days, but it was really just kind of like him giving us some resources to teach us, but we weren't doing anything. And I'm not a type of person that can be okay with that. So I was taking the money we were earning there and I was just learning, but I was learning things I wanted to learn, which were all like training, before I started realizing like, man, I don't think I'm built for finance. Like I don't want to wear a shirt and tie. I don't want to sit in meetings. Even though I was young, I didn't like being in a room where I had no ability to express myself and have an opinion. And when you're in that world, like when people are making multi-million-dollar deals and selling businesses and you have no experience except your school, you're kind of worthless. So I didn't really like being in that situation. And I think my natural mind was more entrepreneurial and risk taking. And so it was probably only, I think, a year before I started being like, oh, okay, I'm actually making a living now coaching people. So now I think I can do this. And maybe I have that naivety where I was like, yeah, I can do this. I can make a living like this equal to Wall Street, which is not true. But at the time, I was going to try to blend those two things. Like take everything I learned in finance, take everything I loved in coaching, and kind of build this overlapping business structure.
Yeah, it is fascinating because you realize that a passion can only take you so far. And a lot of people will find that out. I was like, oh, I love health and fitness or performance, and I want to coach. And if you end up wanting to do your own thing and be entrepreneurial, like there's this whole other side of the house of skills that you need to not only understand, but also be able to implement to then be able to showcase the coaching and the things that you can do. So having those experiences, it sounds like, help get you off on the right foot. And so what were some of your early coaching experiences that started to give you a little confidence that I can actually do this and make a living out of it? You mentioned I started to get a few clients and that sort of got the flywheel going. So what was that process like of getting a few clients and then starting to build a little confidence that like there might be something here?
Yeah, Man, it's weird how things played out because I don't think I was actively looking for clients. I was a very obsessed trainee. Like I wanted to be the best at what I was doing. And I maybe still have some of that, but I think my ego's a little calmer now that I'm older and I'm just more okay with being okay. But I was in martial arts and I had this realization. I started getting pretty good, and then American Top Team invited me to go train with their professional team. They're like, this guy's got talent. He's got D1 wrestling experience. He's big. He's fast. He trains hard. And I trained with their pro team and went into sparring pretty quickly with stand up and got kicked in the head by one of their people that was in the top 10 in the world. And it wasn't like a kick to try to knock me out. We were wearing headgear, we were wearing shin pads. They were informed that I was not a trained striker, so they were not supposed to like be in trying to knock me out. But still, you get kicked in the head for the first time, and it rattled me like where I had a headache the next day. And I was just like, man, I don't think like I want, no matter how good I can get at this, you're always taking a risk to brain damage yourself. And I just didn't see myself training all day, every day to take a fight to win $1,000 and have to do 10 of them a year to make like what I could make working a minimum wage job or something. So I started falling out of love with the idea of being a pro fighter. And CrossFit gave me this like, okay, like you can still get that same like aggression out. It's different because you're racing and you're not doing it like against another direct person with reacting. But I started getting really obsessive and learning about weightlifting from Glenn Penlay and energy systems from James Fitzgerald. And I went and took nutrition courses with Rob Wolf, and I went and took Kelly Starrett's seminars, and I went to all of these things and was learning all this information. And I was in this gym. So people were just starting to come to me for help. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I could make something out of this. So I made a small weightlifting clinic that I charged people for. Then I started a hybrid training program where they would do class and then I would rate them a couple days a week. Then some people were getting burned out from CrossFit and wanting just like to look better and feel better, but they didn't know how to train in a commercial gym. And I was like, well, I've spent my whole life in a commercial gym, so I can help you do that. So I started doing that. Then I started doing just program design for people. And then I started coaching classes in there. And when you added all of that money up, it was like, okay, well, if you're coming out of school from a financial place and you get like an operational job, at that time, you're making somewhere from like $30,000 to $50,000 a year, depending on what type of firm. And then if you go to like a top tier firm, maybe you could make six figures, but I didn't go to MIT, so that wasn't really an option. And I was like, oh, okay, like I'm making that kind of money on a regular basis doing this. And I like this way better than doing that. So it kind of just fell into place. And then I got the job offer from OPT. And it was like, at the time, that was like a dream opportunity because I perceived James as, okay, he's a successful business owner in the space. He won the CrossFit Games, which at the time I was trying to be competitive in at as whatever level I could be at the time. And so I went out there and just continued to fall in love with educating, training. We were doing testing on people there. And then like we kind of had a falling out that we couldn't resolve. And at that point, the passion was just too big. Like the idea of me just being like, okay, I'm going to give this thing up that I really love, that lights my soul on fire, to go get a paycheck somewhere else. It just like at that point wasn't an option for me.
It sounds like you're somebody who loves to put yourself in the room with other really, really smart people, whether that was the internships financially, whether it's American Top Team, going to learn from the best in the business at that time in the health and fitness space. Was there other individuals that you surrounded yourself with that were like that with you, like kind of learning and growing together? Or did you feel like this was still somewhat of a solo personal pursuit at the time?
Yeah, I think I'm very self-governed, and more so when I was younger, antisocial. Like I didn't really know how to have small talk and have conversations. And when people were just, I say it, I'm not saying it derogatorily, but just like normal people who were more healthy and stable and going for normal jobs. I think I was like so crazy and my mind was always running and I always had something to do that I didn't know how to just like banter and do normal social things that took me years of coaching to just develop those skills. So I think most of the time I was head in the books, and then the coaches at Training Think Tank in the early days were kind of my sounding board. So I'd like go learn something like I went to Andrea Ospina FRC course. Then I come back and I organize all the information and I teach it to the coaches and they ask me questions and I put it in a library on the YouTube channel and publish it. So I was kind of like learning within my own culture, running out, learning from other people, bringing it back, teaching it. And that process of like interacting between both of those two segments, I think was more of the way that it happened than me having like a learning buddy where we're like, hey, you go learn this, I learn this, and let's combine ideas. I think it was more like my curiosity can't be satisfied, so I'm going to go out and try to satisfy it and share it with people.
Yeah, and I think that's really fascinating because one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years, if you do surround yourself with other really smart individuals, all of a sudden you're like, wow, there's a lot I don't know that I want to learn, and then you can almost fast track what you're able to not only learn but then implement because there's folks that you're bouncing ideas off of, like you said. And you mentioned Training Think Tank, which I think a lot of folks will know you from, and we're starting to see the pieces of how that came to be with all of the experiences you had and then leaving the opportunity with OPT. So talk to us a little bit of how did you go about creating and coming up with this brand and this idea and bringing it to life then of all these experiences you had and now you wanted to start your own thing?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm vision oriented. So when I left OPT, I had a literal vision of like what I wanted to build, which was a training compound that was like a farm. And I'm obsessed with animals. Like I have the year of the animals, and for whatever reason, I love dogs, cats, just I think maybe more than humans a little bit sometimes. But I had this idea of having this like zoo-like training experience where you could have cross-country athletes or bikers being able to go into the fields and run past animals, and a big barn-based gym where people could train, and cold tubs and saunas, and having like a world-class training compound, but in nature. So that vision of trying to have a group of high-level individuals sharing information on training, solving problems in the training space, helping people. There were these places that I think they still exist where people that get overweight can go live on site somewhere else and they can teach them how to eat and how to disconnect from their worlds and how to get off of junk food. And so I had this idea of having that type of a thing, which obviously requires a lot of money, which I didn't have at the time. So when I left OPT, there were things where I like, okay, well, I disagree with how he did it this way. So if I were doing it my own way, like, what do I want to do? And I kind of had these three core mission things. It was like serve athletes, try to make coaching a more professional thing in the industry. Because when I told people from like the financial world that I was going to be a coach, it was like looked down upon. It's like, why are you going to waste your brain going to do this when you could make money or be in computers or do other things with it? But I loved it and I wanted to get more minds into the space because I think like it's important. And I think our lack of physical culture right now is showing what that could do to the whole system if people don't take care of themselves. And then there was like bullshit in the market that I hated. Like people that just need to like sleep better and move, that are doing like cyclic ketogenic German volume training to lose weight. And I'm like, just like go for a walk and stretch and like eat better. It's not that hard. So I had this idea of building a business that wrapped around those missions. And I thought they were hard problems. Think tank is something in the political and financial sector. So I was like, oh, I'm going to make a think tank, which is a group of people getting together to solve hard problems around training. So the name just became like literal training think tank. And I started with one coach, then added another coach, and then kept adding coaches and mentoring them and kind of building this thing out. And I think on the business side, a lot of it was just trial by fire. Like I didn't realize how hard it was going to be in this industry to try to make a successful, thriving business where I could remain coaching and educating, but then also running the business. Because, the industry doesn't have great margins. It's, people don't value it. So it's definitely a tough quest. And I think I just figured it out as I've gone, like added products where I was like, oh, this might work. Let's see if we could do a lower cost version of this that could scale, or hey, this education worked, let's try it out. Okay, that was too much, let's change it and redo it. And I've just kind of been meandering my way to making it better year after year.
Yeah. And I love the thought and attention of taking all the different experiences, wrapping them up, and creating something that is based on a vision that has you excited traveling forward. Was CrossFit part of that like foundation? I get the sense that with all of your experiences and trying out a variety of things, like you're almost agnostic when it comes to training, like whatever helps people get to the outcomes they're searching for, like we can help you achieve that. I think you've certainly made the name in the CrossFit space. So was that intentional of like, hey, this is something that I want to use sort of as the foundation of the group I'm reaching out to, or did that just kind of work itself out that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of evolved. First of all, I've actually been thinking about this for social media. It's hard to say, like, what is CrossFit? And I think it's gotten more complicated now because there were workouts, for example, that I did when I was like 10 years old, where we would be on a bench, plate loaded bench press, you know, the ones that have the pins that you could move. And we would do like a set of 15, literally until you got to failure. Then we would pull the weight off and go lighter and go to failure. And then we would pull the weight off and go lighter and go to failure. And then when you were done, you'd have to do a certain set of burpees, or you'd have to pick something up and carry it and come back. And we weren't like racing, we weren't going for time, but that stimulus on your body was really like, I was kind of doing CrossFit related things before I even knew what CrossFit was, or before it was an enterprise. So there's like the training side of what CrossFit is. There's how the leaders of CrossFit interpret the methodology, with sometimes I have a different interpretation of like, and maybe they're right because they're the authority. So I don't even know if I would say CrossFit is a like underpinning of my training methods. It's more of an outcome I'm trying for a certain group of people. So some people say, with my fitness, I want to get better at CrossFit. So the training I write for those people is very CrossFit-y. I mean, it's maybe a more structured, progressive, integrating other things into it, but it's kind of just CrossFit training. But if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want to train to be a fighter, a lot of those principles are not going to really be CrossFit. But I learned so much from CrossFit that I think forever it will influence how I write things. For example, growing up, the idea of somebody being really strong and really enduring was not considered as an option. You basically said, hey, if you want to do endurance training, you're going to get weaker. And if you want to get strong, you're going to get less enduring. CrossFit came in and just started breaking these preconceived notions. It was like, hey, you can do both. And not only can you do both, but here are people that are doing both. Here's somebody that's running an 18-minute 5K at 200 pounds and deadlifting over 500 pounds in the same day. And for me, as somebody that was into fighting, I was like, man, that level of fitness and power would be very beneficial to have. And I was always more of a power-driven person. Like, I snatched over 300 pounds like a year into snatching, or a year and a half into snatching. And I was good at Grace and Isabel. But if you got me past like 2, 3, 4 minutes, I was like a wounded water buffalo going through Metcons. So it started breaking these things. It started making training more fun. Like if you wrote a bodybuilding workout in an EMOM format, it becomes more challenging to your mind. You're like, oh, can I finish it in the minute? Oh my God, am I falling off from set to set to set? So now I use AMRAPs and EMOMs and little for time pieces in almost every type of program I write. But I don't do like thrusters and muscle ups for somebody who's just doing general fitness. So I think CrossFit influenced what I do and how I learned about it, but it really, I think, just fell into place for my business because I started working for OPT and then got a name with high level athletes, and then had Travis and Noah and Sarah. And just like, there were a lot of athletes that I think trusted me to give me credit in this market. So I became a CrossFit coach, even though I think I've just been a fitness coach all along who helps people in CrossFit, where then you're acting as both the sport coach and the fitness coach. Whereas in the other sports, you're just the fitness coach, and then they have a basketball coach, or they have a fight coach, or they have somebody for their sport.
And I think that's really interesting because, you know, looking at your background of very sport-based, playing sports, competing in sports, and then even thinking about helping people achieve their goals, that for a lot of folks, it's going to be more of a sport-based outcome goal. It makes a lot of sense then that for people who want to get better at CrossFit, or if you want to call it the sport of fitness, that's where you fell into. When in those early days, was that the type of client that got you most excited? Was like the people who had big aspirations for like putting their fitness on display in a sports setting? Or did you also like, you're sort of, you hate to use the term, but like their average person who comes in saying like, hey, I would love to drop some weight so I can be healthier, so I can play with my kids. Like, were you seeing both, or did you just kind of fall into the bucket of the performance-based athletes?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think both. It's unrealistic in your early career ever to think you're going to have a whole roster of elite people. Like, you're lucky if you ever get one in your life. And I think I'm lucky that I just happened to be like right place, right time. And, it kind of fell in that I started working with them. But I worked with a lot of average people, quote unquote. I think I enjoyed them maybe more, but only if they had a goal that I vibed with. So very early on, and I'm not saying vanity's bad. I just think that training with the approach to vanity all the time is just a losing battle. And you are always unhappy. Like, the people that I met with and coached in the fitness modeling world and the bodybuilding world, it's like you looking at yourself so much to find flaws, to find things to fix. And you're getting older over time and people's responsibilities are happening. So like at some point, I feel like most people, it's like, yeah, you can look as good as you can look. But then refining beyond that is like, all right, well, you're going to need cosmetic surgery and drugs. And literally, you're going to put all of your focus on this one little variable that is just not that high of a priority to me personally. So when people came to me and they're like, I want to break this 5K time, or hey, I want to get back to the body weight that I was at prior to a certain, prior to me getting a job and gaining 15 pounds, or something where there was objective, measurable outcomes, I really got fired up with. The general person who was like, I just want to look better. I'm like, all right, well, how are we defining that? Is it a picture? Is it how I think you look? Is it how you think you look? Is it how your spouse thinks you look? And when I had this subjective murkiness or people that weren't committed to working hard, I just wasn't fired up. But if they have a goal and we're working towards it, I think it could really be anyone. Maybe it's better with average people because the gains I feel like are easier to come from and the appreciation is more. If an elite athlete goes to a competition, they could PR all year in everything worse than they thought they wanted to on a leaderboard and think the whole year is a failure. Whereas that rarely happens with the person who's just training for fitness. They're like, man, I'm so happy. I got better. This got better. This is motivating. I want to try this now. And that's I don't know, it's just a cool process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things too, I feel like is always intriguing is figuring out the balance of taking all the knowledge of the training progressions and the weights and the lifts and the sets, but then you have to blend that with whether you want to call it the psychology, but the people skills of it. And as someone who you mentioned being a little bit more introverted or a little bit more self-focused at times, what did you come to find out in that process of like when you're dealing with people and you can create the perfect training progression and the perfect, workouts, but then there's like the human element to this. Is that something that came natural to you, or is that something that sort of developed as you continue to get deeper into your coaching?
Yeah, I don't think it comes natural to me. I was laughing as you were asking the question because I fired a lot of people early on. And I think I just had a really young, like arrogant attitude where I was like, hey, if you're paying me money and you're not doing it, you're wasting both of our time. So I don't want your money. And would just stop working with people. And what it ended up meaning is that the clients that did end up fitting with me just accepted, like, wow, this guy's intense and like a real straight shooter. And we just vibed because we just both were okay with that. I learned over time, like, oh, this isn't a good way to communicate. And I started working with more women athletes, honestly. That made me start to question, like, oh, I can't speak to them like this. Like, I can't even use these words, or I need to phrase this a little bit differently. Not even realizing how much just like sexism was in my previous lexicon from how we were coached growing up, right? Like, the phrase, don't be a bitch, is like, if you really think about that, it's pretty sexist.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I'm not saying I never use that term anymore, never slips out, but I started reflecting upon my own ability to communicate with different demographics of people. And I realized, like, oh, well, parents don't want me working with their kids because I curse a lot. So I need to be more mindful of cursing. And I think that process just evolved naturally, but I still think my personality type probably just vibes better with certain types of people. And also, I wear my emotions a little bit on my sleeve, even though I think I try to like keep them more contained. I get very excited about projects. So if somebody's like very self motivated and they get better and they do their work and they're fucking organized, so they will fire me up and make me a better coach for them. So I think I just work better with people that are like either they hit a rock bottom where they're so messed up that they realize they need a major change and they're willing to do the work, or they're super high achievers that want every attention to detail. And I like doing that. So I think those are kind of my niches. But I also have coached, a woman for the last 12 years who's just a general physical preparedness person who likes the structure and has tried mountain biking and pole dancing and long distance bike rides and CrossFit. And just like we've gone through that exploration together, which has been fun.
Yeah, that is really cool, especially when you learn your own personal evolution as a coach and you can see how it impacts and relates to different athletes. I think in today's day and age, it's really hard because there's so many coaches and there's so much noise on social media. Have you either intentionally thought about, or how do you go about like communicating sort of your style, who you are, and being able to get your brand, if you want to call it that, out to the world so people can understand, hey, I like his vibe, I like the way he thinks, I want to connect with him? Because like you said, like you're going to get really excited and passionate about people who see the world and have a similar vision, and that makes you want to work with them even more. So being able to communicate that and share that with others, it's a challenging piece of owning a business.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I got very lucky in that Chris Norman, who goes by CTP for the business, who started the video production of Barbell Shrugged, came on in 2017 to work for TTT. And he built the business was growing and steadily increasing prior to him coming on. And we had a social media channel, but he like took it over and professionalized it. And there was a lot of good from that because he thinks about how to make things appealing to watch and entertaining and music and how things look. And I am more of like kind of content driven. Like I'm like, am I educating someone? Am I making somebody laugh? Am I like, I'm not really a good marketer, I don't think. So he kind of crafted a lot of the stuff that goes outward to share about TTT. I think what I've learned and what I'm trying now on a personal platform is, okay, well, somebody gets a part of the brand of Training Think Tank and they might know I run it, or I'm a coach involved in it, or if they're really in it, they know the details. But for most regular people, they see the community, right? Like they see, oh, they have a lot of athletes and they make funny videos and there's multiple people on throwdowns, and it's more of a community type vibe. I've been trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I get my personal message out so that people could understand when they're supporting Training Think Tank, who is the person and what is the mission and what is the passion that goes behind that? Because I think when people make buying decisions and when people find coaches, it is an emotional thing. So they need to know that they trust the person or they vibe with them, or maybe they don't vibe with me, right? Like if I put out super intense shit and say that I had anger management issues when I was young, some people might be like, whoa, I don't want to work with that type of guy. But for me, that's still rewarding because it means that the people that are working with me authentically resonate with who I actually am, not some projected social media thing that I'm masking to get them for a certain outcome. Even though there might be some of that in there, it's really just an opportunity for me to connect with people that do resonate. I don't
Yeah.
know if that answered your question directly. I feel like I rambled
No,
a
it
little.
certainly does. And it helps because I find myself going through the same thing. I mean, and on the receiving end of that, that is something that certainly drew me to Training Think Tank, to hear you talk about the vision and corpus animus and, the mind, body, spirit thing. Like that very much vibed with how I thought about fitness. And when we looked for who we wanted to partner with for affiliate programming and things like that, like that certainly resonates. So there certainly is that element of, even if you've got the greatest stuff in the world, you have to find a way to share it with others so they can even find you, or else they would never know that you even exist and that you can help them. And I think that's a challenging piece, especially for coaches, because they're like, I feel like I've got all this great information, but I don't know how to communicate it or share it, or find people that will resonate and connect with me.
Yeah, it's it's such a tough process. And I've been working on this. So I've mentored a lot of coaches, and you have different coaches with different skill sets, right? Like maybe I can blab my mouth and talk and tell stories. And I've done a lot of crazy stuff. So I have entertaining stories and things to tell and share. But without even like knowing it, I created a interesting persona to share. There are other people that I've mentored that are really great coaches, but they're not that. They're not great storytellers. They're not great marketers. They're not great at creativity and making things or trying new things or whatever, but they're super structured, super regimented. They have very balanced communication if people are emotionally stressed. They help people problem solve, but they don't know how to get their name out and convince other people that they are those things. So it's an interesting process that I think everybody has to go through themselves to figure out, like, well, what are you good at? What can you leverage? If you don't have certain skills, how do you partner with other people that can fill those skills in you, or find coaches that can help you elevate that? Like me going through my own personal journey with emotions and all of this stuff, going through therapy, having to talk through complex emotions, having to talk through challenging situations. Like, well, I had this good stuff in my childhood and this bad stuff in my childhood, but the memories of this bad stuff cause trauma and then mask you from being able to remember some of this good stuff. And working through personal stuff like that made me better as a communicator, because I wasn't then bottled by my reactive emotion. I could listen, process, and go back. But that was my journey. Like that was my weak area. Somebody else who comes from maybe more stability or whatever, they might be like, oh, well, I'm great at working with people and dealing with, emotions and all of that stuff, but I have no technical knowledge. So that person then needs to go out and get their head in books, and, like they have a different process. So I think it's like a self-awareness journey of figuring out for coaches, like, where do you fit in this landscape of people? Are you a leader? Are you a partner? Are you more of like a Sherpa? Or are you more of a drill sergeant? And then when you know your style, you figure out over time, like, well, who's the style that I'm going to mesh well with? And then it starts to kind of build through like word of mouth and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and I like that self-discovery process, because there's so many different assessments, things like that, from personality assessments, leadership style assessments, like you said, communication style assessments, where going to figure out who you are and how you want to interact with other people, and then you can start to leverage all of the skills and things like that you have based on that. And one of the things I'm interested in with training Think Tank then is the vision you had from the beginning, of being this training facility out in nature with animals. It certainly has evolved. You've been at it for a while now. Has the vision continued to remain pretty stable and consistent, or over the years have you found that as the leader of this company, like that vision is changing, you're always kind of that figuring out what's the next thing?
Well, if you just gave me $1 billion, I would build that vision immediately, because it's always been a desire. And I think my home life, like I live on a 2-acre piece of property. I have 5 of my own animals. We farm some food during the spring. I go outside and walk barefoot all the time through my little trail. So it's like I have a home gym. So it's like it's there on a really small scale, and I've been working towards it. I think the idealistic vision that drives people, either like me or just me specifically, you start to realize that like the imagination can do things that you can't always do in real life. Like in an ideal world, I could walk outside and it'd have wings and I'd take off and fly. But the reality is I'm in a normal human body that like sometimes it's hard to sprint without hurting myself. So you start to, as you get older, or for me, my dreams started overlapping with pragmatism. So I started realizing like, yes, I still want this outcome, but that outcome might be 50 years from now, it might be 40 years from now. So what's the next logical step? Okay, if I'm going to help regular average people, owning a commercial gym would be a good place to do that because they come in. Partnering with Travis was a step in being better at understanding, well, how do I communicate? Like, no one's going to have the level of obsession and attention to detail about fitness that I do if they're just like, I want to be a little healthier and train an hour a day. Like, those are two different mindsets in general. But I got a lot of stuff in my brain that could be useful for them to be like, oh, this is good. That's not applicable to me. I want to take this. Travis has trained under me for a really long time, so he has a different interpretation of fitness, even though I've influenced him. So that has kind of gone down that route. The mentorship has been building so that I could make an impact in professionalizing the space. So I think I'm doing it all. It's just a lot of pivoting to figure it out because of either business mistakes I made or business mistakes that CrossFit and CrossFit the sport had made, or me tying a lot of my business to CrossFit the sport and then having the change in ownership and COVID and the Lazar situation all influence my business. So the business side of it has been more of like, okay, you have this end goal that's up here that requires increased revenue, increased valuation of the company. And then here's me in the real world trying to like figure out how to get there, pivoting back and forth, taking step back forward. But the general mission has never really changed, for me at least.
Yeah, I love that the vision remains strong and constant, but the execution can take different shapes and forms as, you know, it evolves, especially as a leader and as you're figuring and navigating, well, what is the way forward for us now, how we continue to execute on what you've outlined. So I love hearing that perspective. And then, you know, you've mentioned that you're somebody who's always charging forward and trying to figure out like what's the next thing, whether it's, you know, educating yourself or diving in deeper with different spaces. So when you start to think about in your current stage, what are the things that either get you really fired up or the things that you're learning and trying to explore and trying to grow in as an individual business owner, coach, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I'm learning this book right here, The Culture Code. I think I've read it in the past, but one of my employees gave it to me to reread. We've been through a restructure and absorbing Travis's gym, which was a previous gym for 10 years. So it had its own community, its own vibe, its own thoughts, trying to figure out, okay, how do we vibe that with the elite side of competing? So trying to figure out how to absorb new coaches and get them up to speed. So I think my personal learning journey right now is around how to influence a culture. And I think that's even reflected in my social media, my attempt at making an impact in social media is I see that the culture itself is oftentimes very emotionally reactionary. So they're not, even if you're emotionally like, there are things that people say on social media that really make me upset at because I disagree with it. But I think because I've had to process so much anger in my life, I'm able to disconnect my emotional processing from my rational processing. So I could be like, man, I'm really fucking angry that people exist that believe something like this that I vehemently disagree with, but also maybe they have a certain point in X, Y, and Z, and maybe I'm not seeing something from their perspective. And I have this process for resolving conflict and wanting to resolve conflict. Like, I don't see that people fighting on these two sides of binary thinking are ever going to get to the right answer because I don't think it's binary in the first place. It's like these are complex social interactions that are involving death and money and business structure and social feelings of rejection, and they're complicated. So I want to get people to think, and that's kind of what I just put out there as an attempt to do that. Maybe I got lost on a tangent there, I feel like.
No, but I love the idea that culture, from what you have say or influence over with the gym that you're currently working on, and then you expand that and say like, well, there's this whole culture around CrossFit, around fitness, around, you know, whatever it might be, and trying to understand and make sense of what it is, and then in what ways can you have some way to influence it or to put your 2 cents in to try and help, you know, whether you want to say build the type of culture you want or create a healthier culture for the industry, sounds like is what's really top of mind for you.
Yes, thank you for, you circled it back to my own thought process. I was telling you that because of the culture code, and I was thinking that one of the things I want to do, if possible, with my social platform in the CrossFit and competitive CrossFit space is encourage a positive shift in culture for people to come together. Like there are corporate things at play with CrossFit HQ, that it is not under the same ownership that originally had this mission that was driving it. Now there is a corporate profit component to it. And whether you like it or not, it's going to influence decision making. So if you're on the opposite end of a decision that they made that you think is unfair from a money perspective, you have to be coming at it from an understanding of, okay, well, then if we're going to align incentives of this side and this side, and their major incentive is making money, then whatever we're asking needs to make sure that it doesn't put that thing at threat, because we need to align the incentives with what they want, with what we want at the same time. And same thing on the other side is like, well, if they're only thinking about money and they're not thinking about like, well, hey, somebody passed away at the games, and that was somebody's friend, it was somebody's brother, it was somebody's dad, or not dad, like somebody that was super meaningful into them. That's a super complicated emotional thing that you can't just like push under the rug and say like, well, people die in triathlons or whatever. Like there's a communication process to grieve properly. So I don't think both sides, which I don't even know if those sides exist or if they only exist in social media world where it's binary, but it seems like it would benefit everybody to be having more civil discourse and be having actual conversations and be putting this stuff out there. So that was my attempt at being like, okay, well, like I'm thinking about the culture of myself and of my brand and of my business. And if I have any influence in the overarching culture of the fitness community, this is the change I want to make. This is like the dialogue I want to start, is like, hey, we all want the sport to succeed. We all want to feel good about the leadership decisions. The people that are participating in the sport want to feel trust in the people that are creating the sport. So if that's the outcome we all want, what are the methods that we can do that work for both sides? And I don't think it turned into that. It turned into like, we're going to take a stand and make an ultimatum, which then made it very difficult on the other side to communicate if they weren't going to do the things on the ultimatum. And I don't know. That's just what's going on in my brain right now, is how to improve culture, both in my own culture and then in the kind of greater culture.
The greater culture. That's right. I know it. What a tie-in, bringing it home there. But yeah, it's fascinating because there's this quote that I've heard from a friend. I've appreciated. It's culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's like, we can have the best strategies in the world, but if the culture that you're a part of, whether it's home life, gym life, whatever avenue you want to go on, isn't helping you succeed, it doesn't matter what your practices are. And I think right now there's, like you mentioned, almost, if you want to call it a culture war of like, well, what is CrossFit about? What is the sport about? What is our gym about? And everybody's confused and nobody really knows where people stand. So they want them to take a strong stance. So that way, then they can know, like, I want to align with that culture, I don't. And so there's a lot of discussion that is going on. And it's great to hear that someone like you, someone who's been in the space for a while and tries to figure out not only your brand, but then how that ties into the larger community plays a role. And so I've appreciated the thoughts and the perspectives, and appreciate hearing your story, on our conversation today. It's fun to hear how some of the things from early life have led to getting excited and building a brand that has now been up and running for a number of years, and the different ways you're impacting individuals, communities, coaches afar. So for those who are interested in connecting with you, what are some of the best ways to connect with either you personally or with Training Think Tank?
Yeah, I'd say probably more important for me to connect to Training Think Tank. The trainingthinktank.com is the website. It's got more info and we're redoing it. So maybe by the time this comes out, it'll be launched or soon coming. The Training Think Tank Instagram channel is just Training Think Tank. And then my personal channel is Max El-Hag, just MAXELHAG with no hyphen, like my actual name. And I've been putting a little bit more stuff on there. I don't know, like as the season gets busy and as the building takes off, if I will keep the consistency there or if it'll be something where it's like, oh, I got a week break, I'm going to make a bunch of content, post it up. So no promises on that front, but we're much more consistent on the Training Think Tank one. We release throwdown content, Corpus Animus podcast, YouTube videos. YouTube's another great way, especially if you're interested in CrossFit, that we put info out there. And if you do that or get on our mailing list, we try to keep everybody up to date on what's coming out on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah, well, certainly great place to check out if you're a coach, athlete, someone who just loves fitness, loves smiling, especially with some of the videos that they put out. Very much appreciative and grateful for what you've built and the way that we've been able to be a part of that with our small part. So thank you for that. And thanks for the conversation. This was a lot of fun. Look forward to the next time we get a chance to interact.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. Appreciate your support.